Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us this morning. We're very excited to have Mississippi River historian Dean Klinkenberg. He drove all the way up from St. Louis to share with us some wonderful presentation based on his book, Mississippi River Mayhem. Right? Mm-hmm. And we are especially grateful to the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund for making it possible for him to be here. And so if you appreciate programs like this, please let us know so we can keep bringing them your way. And at the end of the presentation, if you could fill out a short survey, just a little half slip on the back table there, really appreciate it. It helps with the grant reporting, and we're going to let Dean take it away and show us what he's got.
Thank you, Leroy. And thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all and to share some of these stories. Before we get into this, I just want to mention a couple other quick things. I do have some books at the back for sale, and I'll mention what they are when I get to the end of the presentation. But I do have, this presentation comes from one particular book that I wrote about a year and a half ago. We're going to be getting into some challenging experiences, I think, a little bit. This book focuses on disasters and tragedies that happened along the river. So I try to mix it in with a little bit of humor where I can, and then we'll end, I think, on what I think a more hopeful note. But just so you know, some of these, as you can expect, some things are not that pleasant to hear about all the time. But we're going to dive into it and give it a shot anyway. And one of the things that I like about writing about the river is it gives me an excuse to write about pretty much anything I want, because almost everything in one way or another touches on the river. I have a podcast that I do about the river these days, and I've had episodes about food. I've had an episode about levees and floodplain policy. I've talked with people about what the river means to them and what their connections with the Mississippi are like. I've talked with paddlers. I'm just kind of all over the place, and the disasters kind of fits into that. I have spent so many years in libraries reading about history, and finally I had a chance to pull some of these things together into one book and tell some of these stories about. I think they're stories that are important to hear, but I think it helps develop a little more nuanced and complex relationship with the Mississippi to understand its full history rather than just sugarcoating everything. I'm not very good at sugarcoating, not even in the kitchen. So that's my preface to this, and I'm pretty flexible. Like if something comes up, if there's a question you want to ask in the middle of this, feel free to raise your hand and let me know. We don't have to wait till the end, so I'm okay with interruptions. With that, why don't we just dive right into it? A burst, a crash, and timbers fly, and flame and steam leap to the sky, and men awaken but to die, commend to God their souls. It's a little poem, part of a poem written by one of the survivors of the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history, the sinking of the Sultana. How many of you have heard of the Sultana? A couple of you. All right. So when I do this talk, generally no more than 5 or 10% of the people know anything about the Sultana, which we'll get into why that might be the case a little bit later. But it was a horrible tragedy, and there's so many layers to it that are so distressing, and we'll get into that a little bit too. When I was doing the research for this book, and thinking about what some of the common themes were, I realized that one of the things is that we kind of have these common experiences regardless of the kind of disaster. There are certain sort of experiences or emotions we have that stand out as we deal with confronting these disasters. So I've kind of organized the talk around these basic themes, and starting with the shock, with that initial shock when something happens. So we're going to focus really on 3 different disasters, all of them that are covered in the book. One of them I bet most of you know about as well. So the Sultana was, I think this was the 3rd boat with that name that ran on the Mississippi. And its latter years, let's say the ownership had a little bit of a disreputable reputation. They got in trouble for a few things. They got busted for running contraband to Confederate Army during the Civil War, which the Union Army didn't really approve of so much. But at the end of the war, after the Confederacy and the federal government had reached a truce essentially, and the South was, the Confederacy was releasing prisoners from the war camps. Many of those men who were recently released went to refugee camps at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Thousands and thousands of men were camping in tents, sometimes for weeks on end, waiting for a ride to get back home. Vicksburg was a big river port, has a deep river history. At this point in time, the Union Army was organizing transport to get these soldiers as quickly as they could back home. You know, they're in terrible shape. You know, they're emaciated because they haven't had much to eat. Many of them have been through diseases, and they're just not, you know, the ones that survived are barely alive in many cases. So they're anxious to get home and start getting their lives back together. Well, one of the boats that was used to transport these former prisoners of war was the Sultana. And it pulled into Vicksburg late in April. I won't go into all the details of, you know, some of the shady deals that happened up front, but the boat ended up carrying about 2,300 people. And really, its capacity should have only been about 700 or 800. So it had about 3 times as many people on board as it should have. And you can see from this picture what that looked like. This picture was taken at Helena Harbor, Helena, Arkansas, and it's the last known picture of the boat. And it captures a sense of how crowded it was. Like, one of the slightly funny things about this experience is that when the men realized there was a photographer on shore at Helena, a lot of them moved to that side of the boat to try to wave and get in the picture, which, as you can imagine, started to get the boat to tilt a little bit. So the crew had to get everybody back to the other side to maintain their balance. So this boat is grossly overloaded. And as I understand it, that wasn't terribly unusual. The Army often overloaded steamboats to get their men more quickly and more efficiently to wherever they were trying to get them. So it wasn't terribly unusual, but I think even this was excessive with 2,300 people on board. The boat left Helena, went to Memphis, stopped there for a few hours, and after it left Memphis around midnight, made a quick stop in the middle of the river. So the boilers that powered this boat ran on wood mostly. And they have to stop periodically to wood up, to load cords of wood that they're going to burn in their boiler. And there was a supply boat, a barge in the middle of the river that they made a quick stop at to grab some wood before they were going to continue on upriver. Not more than half an hour after the boat had wooded up and they were underway, a boiler exploded on the Sultana, and then 2 more exploded in quick succession after that, and then it was just total chaos ensued. One of the men who was on board at the time was a man named Joseph Bringman, and he was asleep on the top deck. And he wrote, he was having a dream. He dreamt that he was on a rock ledge overlooking the river. And he felt, he wrote that the rock seemed to burst with a report like the shot of a distant cannon. I felt pieces of rock striking my face and head, and I seemed to be hurled out into the river. So he's in this dream state, and he's having this, basically his 2 worlds are colliding at this point. And when he felt these rocks hit his face in the dream, he woke up. And when he woke up, he was in the river. He was no longer on the boat. So he had survived the explosion, but he was now off the boat and in the water. He was lucky in that sense, because a lot of the passengers who died right away. When boilers explode, there's shrapnel, there are pieces of metal and wood that get flung all over the place that will kill people. And the steam that comes out of the boiler itself is deadly. And if you're within a certain distance of that steam, it'll kill you right away. So he got into the water. Now, the one you may know more about was the Armistice Day blizzard of 1940. I'm familiar with that, because I think this area certainly was impacted by that. It was a gorgeous November day, probably like yesterday. Although yesterday stayed nice. Yeah, well then you couldn't afford to live here, so. So it was kind of the peak of duck hunting season, but it had been a really terrible season so far. It had been unusually warm, and the birds hadn't really migrated much yet. And on this morning, a lot of hunters went out hoping that maybe this would be one of their last chances to have a good hunt. So they were pretty lightly dressed for the most part. 'Cause I think in some places it was near 60 degrees on this November morning. They got up, they went out. We didn't have weather forecasts then like we do now. You know, at the time, the Weather Service would release, I think, 2 forecasts a day, about 12 hours apart. And they came from a central office, I think in Chicago at this time, that they just sent to like the Minneapolis office, and then it ran in a newspaper, or if you lived in a rural area, you might hear the weather report from your mail carrier. You know, it was a very different system. So the people who left that morning to go duck hunting really didn't have any idea what was coming. And I'm not entirely sure the Weather Service understood either the magnitude of what was about to happen. What really happened is that these 2 big storm systems combined over the middle of the country. There was a big storm coming in from the west coast, and if you've ever seen video footage of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, that the wind is blowing and the bridge starts to shake and eventually just falls apart, that was the same storm system, but that was a little early, that was before it got to the Midwest. That combined with a big system that came up from the Gulf of Mexico, and they combined into, I'm sure we would call it something catchy today, a superstorm of some kind, but by the time I got over the middle of the country, it was a massive storm, and it was bringing in extremely cold air from the north, but it was still very warm out in front of it. So the folks who went out, their day started fine, but then it began to rain a little bit. The rain got heavier, then it turned to sleet, then it turned to snow, and by noon or so, the winds were really picking up. And at that point, there were wind gusts up to 80 miles an hour. And if you were on the Mississippi River, there were winds the waves were reaching 15 feet high on the river just from the wind. So if you're on a John boat or a little, hunting skiff, you're no match for any of that. So those guys were trapped. There were a whole bunch, hundreds of men who ended up having to weather the storm on islands or somewhere like that in the woods, because they couldn't get out of those areas. The third disaster we're going to talk about is another steamboat, but it's a different time period. After the Civil War, railroads basically made river shipping irrelevant. They handled all the cargo and passengers for the most part, and river shipping became more regional or just for pleasure. So in 1890, this boat, the Sea Wing, operated around Lake Pepin. I think I've got a picture I'll show you in a little bit if you're not familiar with that area. This was kind of the peak of the logging boom, or near the end of the logging boom in many ways. So the northern pine forests were being harvested, and those trees were being cut up into logs, and they would assemble them into these giant log rafts and move them on rivers. And the Sea Wing was really built to push those log rafts down the river to mills. But it had enough deck space that they occasionally ran excursions too. And on this July day in 1890, on a Sunday, the captain advertised an excursion where they were going to run from Red Wing down 15 or so river miles to Lake City, Minnesota. And in Lake City, they would stop and they would visit a National Guard encampment. This was how people passed their time before they had Facebook and streaming services. They went and watched the National Guard troops do their thing, practicing military exercises, checking out their uniforms and tents. So that was the main thing. When they got down to Lake City, then there were parades and all these events that were going on. Now the Sea Wing, some people considered it. I don't think a lot of experienced river people consider this a good boat. The words that were used to describe it were things like unwieldy, top heavy, those kinds of things. I don't think it got a lot of love from river people. But on this day, they were running this excursion, and it was the social event of the summer, perhaps. People wore their Sunday best. People dressed up in some of the best clothes they had. I think I've got a description here. Mary Leach, one of the passengers, she wore a black satin bodice, a new black satin parasol lined in red and edged with a black lace ruffle. And everybody was dressed up like this. 50 cents round trip. This was the captain, the guy in the middle, David Weathern, and that's his wife and his 2 sons. They went on the cruise with him. There was this odd premonition. his home base was a little river town called Diamond Bluff, which is on the Wisconsin side. And there had been this itinerant preacher who had been in Diamond Bluff for a little while. And for a few days before this cruise, after he knew it was advertised, he was warning people not to go on this, that he'd had this premonition that something terrible was going to happen. And he was trying to warn people that they shouldn't ride this boat. I don't think he changed anybody's minds, but after the boat left and it was clear that this excursion was going to happen, the preacher reportedly left town, and he told people on the way out that he couldn't bear the thought of being around the grief that they were about to experience. So these stories are fun. I don't think there's any way I'll ever be able to confirm whether that's true or not, but it's an interesting sort of layer to this whole story. Let's see. So they got underway. They got most of their passengers out of Red Wing. They made a couple stops before then, but Red Wing was where probably 2/3 of the passengers came from. And it was a pretty happy crowd, skewed kind of young. People were in a good mood. And the cruise went fine for the first half. As they were boarding in Red Wing,
Your PowerPoint doesn't like to work today.
No. Oh, we're back. All right. My computer just wants to go to sleep. As they were boarding in Red Wing, there were a couple of young boys who were watching this process, and one of the crew members said, if you two want to come, if you guys would help, we'll give you a free ride on this cruise. So one of them was a 10-year-old named Linus, and if you're 10 years old, I mean, come on, a free cruise, who's going to turn that down? So they helped carry some ice and some provisions on, and they jumped on and joined the cruise, but they didn't have time to run home and tell their parents that they were going on this boat. And of course, no cell phones back then. They couldn't call. So this is the route. Red Wing is up here. And they just kind of traveled down this way to about halfway down. Lake City is kind of right in the middle there. It took about 90 minutes. They got down there. The weather's still pretty good. They had a chance to cruise around, look at people, and then around the time the big dress parade was supposed to happen, heavy rain started to fall. And the weather got dicey for the rest of the afternoon. So Mary Leach and a couple of her friends, they found cover in a saloon or something in Lake City, or a store, and they ended up staying there so long, in fact, that they ended up not missing the return trip. They didn't hear the bell when the captain was ringing the bell that they were finally going to leave. There was a lot of debate about when they should go. There were a whole bunch of passengers who were just anxious to get home. They were supposed to leave at 6 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock the weather was still too dicey. The captain waited. He wasn't sure if he should go or not, but he had his people to return. Right? They couldn't stay there forever. And he had some people telling him they shouldn't go back at all. So there were all kinds of conflicting advice, and he didn't have the National Weather Service to turn to with a forecast. He saw a break, figured it was time, a good enough time to go. So around 8 o'clock, finally, they got underway and started making their way back. Now, not everybody, as it turned out, was excited about this decision. One of the passengers, a guy named Charlie Sewell, after they were underway, he kind of looked at the sky and he said, "Goodbye, boys," and he jumped off the boat and he swam back to shore. So. One of the things that always happens in these is you hear stories of incredible feats of survival. So I want to tell you a few of those. Some of them are funnier than others, and most of them are not funny, but some of them are inspiring. This one's kind of funny. During the Armistice Day blizzard, Minneapolis basically was shut down. So there were a lot of people who were stuck in downtown Minneapolis. The streetcars were kind of running, but it was taking them hours to run one route. So a lot of people just looked for a place to sleep in downtown. So hotel lobbies, department stores, car shops, all kinds of places took people in and stayed for the night. But in the midst of all this craziness, with this heavy snow falling, the intrepid marketers for Spam were still roaming around the street. And they would walk up to strangers and ask if they had a Spam key and a can of Spam on them. And if they said yes to both of those, they gave them a crisp new $2 bill. So even in the midst of all this, marketing continues, right? There we go. Nope, actually, we go back this one. I don't have as many funny stories from the other parts of the blizzard, though, unfortunately. The rest of the areas down around the Mississippi, people really were doing everything they could to find a way to survive. So there was a small group of men, Gunner Miller among them, who had been hunting. They were on an island near Winona when they got trapped. They knew they weren't going to be able to go anywhere because the snow was blinding. They couldn't see 5 feet in front of them. So they got the gasoline out of their boat motor, and soaked some wood and fired their guns into it, which lit a spark and got the fire going, and then they burned their decoys through the night to stay warm. And the next morning, when they got up and the visibility was a little better, they found a couple of men just 60 feet away from them who had frozen to death overnight. Downriver, there was a father and a couple of sons who were doing the best that they could to survive, and the oldest son was an athlete, and they decided the best way to survive was to jump up and down throughout the night to try to stay warm. So every time his younger brother would stop, the older brother would punch him to get him motivated to keep jumping. It was enough for the younger brother to survive. He was in pretty rough shape in the morning when he was found, but unfortunately his older brother and his father didn't make it through the night. Yeah. And on the Sultana, one of the more unusual stories of getting off the boat and surviving, one of the passengers, right after the boilers exploded, a man next to him had been killed by shrapnel. And this guy, William Luganbiel, some interesting names in the 19th century, he remembered somebody had brought an alligator on board. And I don't remember exactly what the purpose of this was, but somebody had an alligator in a box. So he ran down to where this alligator was kept, and he opened the box, and he ran a bayonet through the alligator's head to kill it, and then dumped the alligator out. And then he had this big box. He threw it in the river, and he jumped in behind it. It took him 3 tries, but he finally got inside it, and he was able to float in that until he was rescued the next morning. So it was a pretty creative escape. One of the major problems, there were so many challenges to surviving the Sultana disaster, and one of them was just, the Mississippi River was high. This was late April. The river was above flood stage. The river's moving fast. There's a fair amount of debris, floating logs and things, but the water's still cold too. So hypothermia was a major factor for people. So they couldn't just float in the water for hours. They had half hour to an hour at max probably before the coldness of the water would just induce hypothermia, and then they would drown. So they were looking for every way that they could find to get out of the water. He found a pretty unusual way. And there was one other here, another man, William Bohr. He knew he had to get off the boat, and he had a clothing bundle, and he found some scrap wood, threw those in the water, jumped in, and managed to tie it together to create a makeshift raft. And he got on this thing, and it was working, it held him, and then unfortunately he ended up getting sucked into a whirlpool. And he was expending all of his effort fighting this whirlpool, trying to get out of it, and he couldn't do it. He was getting weaker and weaker, and he eventually just gave up. And the whirlpool sucked him down, but then it spit him out just a few feet away. And he came out fine, and his makeshift raft was right there too, still in good shape, so he was able to hop back on that. So this is one of the things that I understand now intellectually, but probably in the moment it would still be hard to do. Like everybody, all the river rats that I know have told this same basic story. Like the reason people drown in whirlpools is because they fight against the current, and then they get tired, and then they drown. And if you just go with it and let it pull you down, it'll pop you back up safely somewhere else. So there's my handy tip of the day. If you're ever caught in a whirlpool on the Minnesota River, or just stay away from the whirlpool. That's probably the even better, safer advice. So after he had popped up and was back on this raft, though, so there are a lot of people in the water, and a lot of them are competing for these safety nets, for these pieces of wood. Another man came by and was begging William to share that space with him, and William didn't want to do it at first because he wasn't sure it could hold the weight of 2 people. But this man was persistent, and of course, he was doomed if he didn't get some help like that. So William eventually gave in. He pulled him up. It held. They both floated on this little makeshift raft well enough, and they managed to float to shore eventually. So they both ended up surviving. Now on the Sea Wing, where we left off, Charlie had jumped off the boat and swum to shore, and they were just about on their way back up. They were chugging along about 5 miles upriver from Lake City, and so the one thing I forgot to tell you, so the Sea Wing had a barge tied to the back of it, like this flat boat basically, that they used as the party area. So they had the band set up, they had a dance floor there, and under normal circumstances this is not problematic at all. But now, with the storm around and with the winds blowing, it's getting a little tricky to steer the boat, and you've got this barge behind you that's kind of making things a little trickier too, that's changing the way the boat handles. So as they get into the winds again, the captain looks ahead and he sees a squall line moving toward them. So he turns the boat to go straight into the winds, which is the only choice he really had at that point. Back on the barge, it's kind of plopping around, going up and down in the waves, and people are debating whether it's helping or hurting the boat. Some of them were thinking the best thing to do might be to cut the barge loose, and then the boat might have a better chance of getting back upriver. Unfortunately, before they could do that, they watched as the winds tilted the boat 45 degrees to one side, paused for a little bit, and then it flipped completely over. So there were a lot of people who are inside the cabin of the Sea Wing. Some of them, there were a lot of women inside there. So some women had moved from the barge inside the cabin because they thought the guys were getting too rowdy, and they wanted to get away from that. And at one point, the captain had advised people to move inside the cabin for safety, and then he had changed his mind and tried to get them to go back out, but not many people went back out. I think they felt probably a little safer being inside there. So when the boat flipped, they were all doomed. Meanwhile, the people on the raft were still exposed to the elements now. They're floating free. They have no way to steer it. They have no cover. It's hailing. There's lightning and heavy rain. And they have just witnessed this horrible tragedy. So, there's some people who are in the river trying to survive. There are some people trying to get to the barge, or others looking for anything to hang on to. The captain was trapped in the pilot house when the boat flipped over, Captain Wethern. The first couple tries he made to kick out the glass didn't work, but eventually he was able to break the glass, and he swam out and got up to above the water line. He couldn't find his family. He was looking around for his wife and 2 boys and couldn't find them anywhere. So that things got very dicey very quick there. Let's see. There were all kinds of stories about the things people did to try to survive in this circumstance. Again, it's dark, it's windy, like I said, the hail. A couple of guys, couple of teenagers found a piece of scrap wood that was big enough for the 2 of them, and they jumped on that. They had no way to steer it, so they were above the water, but they were floating at the mercy of the winds and the current at that point. And they would spend hours just kind of floating back and forth, hoping they would get to shore. Let's see. Let's go on to this. So people are doing everything they can to try to survive. And in the midst of this, other people are doing remarkable things to try to help other people out. It's one of the things, I think one of the lessons that still reassures me from reading about these terrible events is that in these moments of crisis, there's still a lot of us that are willing to put our lives on the line to help somebody else, even if it's somebody that we don't know. And I find great comfort in knowing that and remembering that. On the Sultana, I won't read this whole story, but there was a story about a woman who was I think she was a paying passenger on the boat, who was watching the chaos after the explosion. All these men in the water fighting each other, fighting over each other, trying to get some little scrap. And she watched this, and she started yelling at them, basically, and telling them to behave and get a grip on themselves. And she kept at it, and she actually had an effect, and she got them calmed down. And they were able to, that helped them then find a rope or something else to hang on to. The boat was also on fire, and she decided to stay on the boat and sacrifice herself because she was worried that if she jumped in the river, they would be distracted about trying to save her and the chaos would start again. So rather than risk that, she stayed on the boat to keep them calm and sacrificed herself. I'm not sure I would be able to do that, but it was pretty remarkable. During the blizzard, the Scott Motor Company was one of the places that took in strangers. They had at least 20 people that were staying in their company, and some of them were sleeping in cars. A neighborhood restaurant brought food to feed everybody who was stranded there. In a lot of the small towns, people took in strangers. Their school buses got stuck in snowdrifts, and if there was a farmhouse nearby, they would just walk the kids over to the farmhouse. There was one farmhouse I read that had 20 school children staying with them for 3 days. So imagine that. And of course, some of these heroic rescues that happened in the midst of all these things were pretty inspiring too. But on the Sea Wing, one of the National Guardsmen had gotten word that the disaster had happened, and he knew he had access to a rowboat, but he needed somebody to help him. It took a little while for him to find another person that would go with him in this rowboat and go out. And you kind of understand, I suppose. The storm is still raging, and you don't know what you're rowing into. But he wanted to get out there, and a man named Wesley Hills and Corporal B.L. Perry. They were the first ones who got out onto the river and started rescuing people. And on that first pass, they found 3 women, rescued them, and brought them back to shore, and they made a couple of other trips and rescued several more people. At one point, that barge that was floating free got close enough to shore that a couple of guys were able to jump off. So just north of Lake City, there's a peninsula that juts out that's called Central Point, and that's about where they were able to jump off. But then they had to run a mile plus from there to get down to Lake City, and they rang alarm bells and were trying to round up rescue teams, and they found a rowboat, and those 2 men who had just gotten off the barge went in a rowboat and went back out, and they rescued 18 people in 3 trips. On the Sultana, again, this is the middle of the night. It was somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning, if I remember right, when the boilers exploded. But people who lived nearby saw the explosion or heard it or felt it. It was, you couldn't miss that it happened. And John Fogelman and his family lived next to the river. They built a makeshift raft, and they were one of the first ones to get on the water to rescue people who were stranded on the Sultana. Now, one of the things that they did was the boat was on fire, but the fire had started in the back and was working its way toward the front. So there was a big group of people who had gathered on the bow of the boat. But they didn't have a lot of time because that fire was coming toward them. So they had to get off eventually. And he and his sons were able to get there and make enough trips back and forth that they rescued 100 people from the boat. And then their house became a makeshift hospital. There was another one. Oh yeah, a guy named Franklin Barton also lived on the shore. He was on the Arkansas side. He was a recently discharged Confederate soldier, and he had a canoe, and he got in his canoe and he went out and started rescuing people himself. And he later told a reporter that he did not care if they were Federal soldiers. Humanity demanded they should have help, and that he would do all in his power to help him. So, in the blizzard, near Red Wing, there was a bachelor farmer, probably a Norwegian bachelor farmer, if you remember Prairie Home Companion.
Norwegian?
Yeah. Abe Coons. Big guy, 6'4", and he had heard that there were some hunters who were stranded not far from his property. So he, of course, had a rowboat. Everybody who lived near the river apparently had a rowboat handy. And he pushed off to see if he could find them. And he didn't get very far before he realized that he couldn't sit upright and row. The winds were too strong, so he was going to have to lay down and row while he was flat. Well, he found these guys. There were 4 of them. And he managed to get all 4 of them off the island and back to his house, even though he could only take one at a time. So it took him 4 trips doing that, under those conditions. Max Conrads is a pretty well-known aviator if you're into aviation history. The airport in Winona is named after him. The next morning after the sun came up, he got out his pilot cub and he wanted to fly scouting missions over the river to see if he could spot people who were stranded and guide rescue teams to them. But that's a little plane, and the winds were still blowing strong. So it apparently took 10 men to get his plane out of the hangar and into the air. He had 5 on each wing, and essentially when they let go, the wind pretty much just took him into the air. So he could only go 20 to 30 miles an hour when he was flying into the headwind, but he'd go 130 when he had a tailwind. And his plane wasn't supposed to go more than 75 or 80. But he spent hours in the air flying over the islands.
Yeah, the stall speed on a Piper Cub is about 25 miles an hour. So if you got a 30-mile-an-hour wind, the plane will fly by itself.
And he knew what he was doing, obviously. He felt he could handle it, and obviously he did. So,
What was the date of this blizzard, what year?
1940.
Armistice Day, so it was November 11th.
November 11th, 1940, right. Yeah, so he spent those hours, and he would drop some packages to people. He had some care packages with food and some things to keep warm. But mostly what he did is that he would either guide the rescue teams to where people were stranded, or if they were in a tough spot, that he would help guide them down a safe path so they could get closer to the rescue team. And I don't know how many people he was responsible for helping get out of there, but it was, I'm sure, dozens of hunters who were still alive. You know, one of the constants in all this, too, is that we just don't do well with uncertainty. You know, especially in the midst of a tragedy like this, we want to know what happened, and oftentimes very quickly we kind of want to know who to blame for what happened as well. And a lot of times those answers just are not available. They're just not forthcoming. In these events, you know, you can imagine with the blizzard, the Weather Service took a lot of flack at that time for not producing a better forecast. But I'm not sure how fair that is. At the time, they probably did the best that they could, and maybe eventually they did a lot better. But their weather forecasting methods were fairly simple at that time anyway. But after this blizzard, they did make several changes, and one of them was they allowed the regional offices to make their own forecasts instead of having it come from one central place like Chicago, and they had forecasts that came out more often. So there were some changes that came in the wake of that. With the Sultana, there were all kinds of rumors about why those boilers exploded. There was one rumor that the crew had been drunk, and that's why the boilers had exploded, because they hadn't been paying enough attention to the pressure valves on the boiler. There was a rumor of sabotage. So one of the persistent rumors during the Civil War was that somebody would slip an explosive device into a cord of wood. So when a steamboat came by and loaded up all this wood, when they loaded that cord with an explosive device, it would destroy the boat. I don't think that ever happened. I've never found a definitive case where that actually happened. And it was not the case here. But those rumors persisted. I found a newspaper article from a St. Louis paper 40 years after the fact that was still saying sabotage was the likely cause. Now, there are whole books written about this disaster and speculating on what the real cause was. You can read all of those if you wish. My take, after reading all this, is that it probably was just the boilers were flawed from the beginning. They did have to make some repairs on the fly, and some people pointed to that as the problem, but the type of boiler that they used on the Sultana, I think, was just a deeply flawed design. And there were at least 2 other steamboats that had the same kinds of boilers that had explosions as well. And not long afterwards, those boilers were taken out of service. So I think that's the most likely cause of this. And they were probably being overworked too, because the boat was just carrying way more load than it was designed for.
Well, the lifetime of a wooden steamboat on the Mississippi River was very short.
About 3 years, 3 to 5 years.
And then they would take all of the boilers and the equipment off of that and build another steamboat. So the machinery on this, a lot of these boats were very old.
Yeah.
And worn out, like you said.
Yeah.
And there was really there's no OSHA, there's no Steamboat Bureau or anything like that, so it was just whatever.
Right, and during that period of time, there was a lot of resistance to having any regulation, especially at the federal level, of any of the steamboat trade. So yeah, we don't know this. We don't think about this so much. There's a lot of nostalgia around that period of time with steamboat travel. Thousands of people died in steamboat accidents.
Oh, yeah.
It was a very dangerous way to travel. And most of those people who died in boiler explosions. So now with the Sea Wing, as you might guess, the person who took most of the heat was the captain. It's his responsibility. He made the decisions. And one of the remarkable things is that the first investigation of this was just 3 days after the accident. It didn't take weeks to organize a commission to look into this. 3 days after the fact, they were already collecting data and trying to figure out what happened. And the initial report was very hard on the captain. So on the river, there are different kinds of pilot licenses, and he apparently did not have the proper kind of license to lead an excursion. He had the proper license to do what he did when he was pushing log rafts, but you needed a different kind of license to do excursions and have passengers. He didn't have that. So that didn't look very good for him. And his boat was only supposed to have 175 passengers, and as they were counting up who was on board, it looked like he was carrying 200 to 210. So, yeah.
Was he able to save his wife and children?
No. So, and that was one of the things I'm just about to get to is, yeah. So what the commission initially suggested, they were going to refer him to the courts for criminal charges, and they suspended his license. But none of that happened. And in fact, he got his license back fairly quickly. And my part of the speculation was just that he lost one son and his wife. And I think there was some feeling maybe that he had suffered enough. And besides that, there were people on the boat who had survived but lost family members who defended him. So not everybody thought his decisions were bad. It was a little ambiguous about how much blame he really should get.
Was he also the owner of the Sea Wing?
He was the owner. In fact, I didn't mention, he had a co-owner, but this was probably going to be their last trip with that boat. They'd already made arrangements to sell it.
On that piece you have up there from the newspaper, it says, talking of lynch law. Was there a law that allowed people to go lynch people?
I think that's more of a, I don't think there was an actual law at that point. It was kind of
Of lynching.
yes, or more like an extrajudicial punishment. A polite way of saying it. They're going to take the law into their own hands.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Off the top of my head, I forget the history of that, but there is, that does come from a particular person. Lynch was a real person, and that term comes from that individual, but off the top of my head, I forget the whole history of that. Yeah.
Why were the Secret Service involved? Do you know anything about the background of that?
I don't remember that, no. It might have been that they just had some jurisdiction over maritime law at that point. Yeah, but I'm not sure. So he ended up going back to his hometown, to Diamond Bluff, and eventually he remarried. people didn't really seem to have a grudge against him. He eventually won election to a local office, like a county commission or dog catcher or something like that. And he lived out the rest of his life there. His surviving son, Roy, went on to be a riverboat pilot on his own, very well respected riverboat pilot. And many years after his father had died, somebody asked him how his father had dealt with this terrible tragedy. And his son said that, yeah, his father eventually went back into piloting boats on the river, but it was years before he ever saw his dad smile again. It had to be a heavy burden to carry. And that's where the last part comes in. You know, after all of this, we look for ways to express our grief over the losses that we've suffered in these events. And there's some very moving examples of this that I came across in researching this. The Sultana, you know, the people who died in that, I don't think ever got the recognition and the ceremonial grief that they deserved. They never got that. There are so many reasons for this. So this is a monument to the Sultana victims that was erected by survivors. It was paid for by people who survived it, and it's in a cemetery in Tennessee, not even on the Mississippi. That's about the only monument to the Sultana.
It's a long way from where it's saying.
Yeah. And then there's this little museum in Marion, Arkansas. They might actually be bigger now. A couple of years ago, they started a campaign to raise money so they could have a bigger building and do more justice to this. But I think, you know, the Sultana was just kind of a bad timing in a sense. The war was over. You know, we as a country had been through so much trauma already. People were ready to move on. They wanted to, and this was another tragedy in a long line of tragedies. It was a few days after Lincoln had been assassinated. So they just, I don't think, had the capacity to take in yet another big tragedy. But the Sultana is the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history. We don't really know how many people died on the boat because we don't know how many were on board for sure. They didn't have a full passenger list. But the best guess is about 1,500, which is more than died in the Titanic. Some of the survivors got together for reunions for a few years. And one of the best memorials that I came across, one of the survivors, a guy named Chester Berry, interviewed people and solicited their stories from what happened on the boat and a little bit about what their lives were like after that. So there's this whole book. It's a collection of those firsthand accounts of those folks. And a lot of them name people they knew who died in the accident. It's a really interesting book to read through. You can find it on Google Play. Like it's well out of copyright by now, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, his book is available on the internet. Red Wing, you know, they suffered the most from the Sea Wing disaster. The majority of passengers on board had been from Red Wing. 98 people in total died in this accident, and most of them were from Red Wing. One of the more shocking numbers was that, you know, the boat had 57 women on board. 50 of them died.
Were they able to recover all the bodies?
I think they did recover all of them, yeah. Yeah. It took a while. I think it took 3 or 4 days, I think, before they had accounted for everybody. And which means during that whole time, you know, they're bringing some bodies back on other boats, but most of them are coming up by train from Lake City. So there are crowds gathered at the train station in Red Wing, you know, because there's no other way to get news about who they found. And people are wondering, you know, waiting for some news about their loved ones, if they survived or not. So, you know, hundreds of people who spent hours at the train station waiting for some word. Those 2 teenagers, they made it. They landed on shore about 5 o'clock in the morning after floating aimlessly, being at the mercy of the wind. They survived. They were fine. Unfortunately, one of the last bodies recovered was 10-year-old Linus, one of the 2 boys who had jumped on at the last minute. He did not make it. The city, the buildings, they hung black sheets in the fronts of buildings. doorknobs. They attached black crepe paper, which I guess was a tradition at the time. And they had a big ceremony, a big memorial service in town that drew 5,000 people. They had these elaborate floral displays honoring the people who died. And the local photographer went around collecting pictures of all the victims that he could, and I think he found photos for 89 of the 98 who died. Put it together in a collage. This is one part of it. And that collage is still hanging in City Hall in Red Wing. A very good tribute. There were lots of speeches, a lot of what you would expect, but the city attorney, I thought, had a really good way of summing this up, and I just want to read you a little bit of his speech. When a sorrow has fallen upon us, when the mind has become weary with reflection and the eyes dim with weeping, a word of sympathy, however homely or crudely spoken, a tear, while it cannot remove the burden, may, so far as human sympathy can aid those who have been bereft of friends, soften the pangs of sorrow and assist in preparing the heart to bear the burden. It was a beautiful sentiment, I thought. You know, ultimately, one of the things that just jumps out at me from all this is our resilience. We go through some terrible things. Life is not always great, right? But we have the capacity to not just survive, but get back on with our lives after these events. I come to the point now where I think of resilience essentially as the confidence to get through whatever life throws at me. That I have developed enough skills that I have the confidence that no matter what terrible thing might happen, I can figure out a way to get through it. And I don't know what the alternative is. We're always going to face challenges in our life. We always have to find ways of making our peace with that, grieving those losses, whatever, and then getting on with things. So, and then the other part of this, other than just the resilience itself, when you're reading these stories, was how important it was to have a community. All of these places, people would come together to collectively grieve and to help each other out in the aftermath, not just during the tragedy, but in the aftermath of the tragedy too. So it's just so critical to have those connections and to have people that you could rely on in the community. So those are my words of wisdom. Now we get to the marketing section. So these are a few of the stories. I have a lot more detail about all of these stories in the book, the Mississippi River Mayhem, and I've got stories about floods and other steamboat wrecks, about the New Madrid earthquakes, cholera and yellow fever epidemics. I got to tell you, it was a little surreal because I was researching those in the early days of the COVID pandemic. So I wasn't sure if that was a good idea or not, but I had to do it. And then there's even a chapter on the I-35 bridge collapse. So there's a fair amount of Minnesota connections as well, but just stories of disasters up and down the Mississippi. But I do other things that aren't nearly as difficult to read either. I have guidebooks. I have a guidebook for the upper half of the Great River Road if you're interested in traveling along the Mississippi. I have a big book to help with that. And I write mysteries set along the river. So all of those are set in different places along the Mississippi. The third one, Letting Go in La Crosse, is kind of split between La Crosse and Winona. And then I have a podcast about the river. So if you're a podcast person, you like audio, you like taking things in via audio, I'm up to 32 episodes now. And I'm taking a short break until mid-January, but I cover anything that even remotely touches on the river. So food, I talked with a Southern chef about food, what she's learned about food in river towns. I talked with General Galloway about the flood of 1993. Talked about levee policy, talked with paddlers about their experiences, paddling long distances or with outfitters, taking people out on the river. History, the Marquette Joliet expedition just had its 350th anniversary this year, so I talked with a historian about that. It just gives me an excuse to talk about whatever I feel like talking about and find some way to connect it to the Mississippi. So there we have it. Thank you very much for your attention and for coming today. Do we have any questions?
I have a question.
There's a lot of newspapers, and thank goodness for the internet now, because there are a lot of things I can get to from home that I never would have been harder to get to 20 years ago. So yeah, a lot of newspapers. Newspapers.com has scanned millions and millions of newspaper pages, so that helped for some things. I have a chapter on the fire in St. Louis in 1849, but there wasn't anything scanned that was available there, so I had to go to the library. I went down to the library and I scanned through microfilm and read old newspaper articles about that. And then there are books, a lot of books from the 19th century that contain these first-hand accounts. Many of them are now scanned and available online, so I could read those from home, like the Berry book. I found that just by searching around and was able to read that at my leisure in my comfortable clothes at home. So, yeah, it's all kinds of different things. And during the first part of the pandemic, even though our history museum was closed to the public, the staff were still working, and they took requests. So they would scan materials and email them to me, since I couldn't visit in person. So there were personal letters in their collection that I really wanted to read, and they scanned them for me and sent it by email. So I ended up being able to do a lot of the research that way, but I also had so many notes. Like I said, I've been visiting libraries in river towns for years, and I took notes on anything that caught my interest. And I always like these stories that go beyond the boring basics. Every one of these old history books will tell you who the first settler was, who the first white baby was, all these kinds of things. And I find that stuff really boring. I kind of like to know when people showed up and the town was founded, but I want to know something about their lives, what their real lives were like and their personalities. So, and a lot of times these kinds of disaster stories had really interesting peeks into what life was like at that time for people. So I collected all these notes for years, and then had a chance to put it into this book.
I would guess all those librarians and people at the historical museums are wonderful helps.
They are the best people on the planet. Absolutely. I love libraries and the people who work in them. They've been very good to me. And very, very good to you too, I assume, too. So.
Any other questions? Let's give you a round of applause.